The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's bar as Sarah Chun pulled her hood tighter around her face. At 28, she had learned to blend into crowds, to become invisible when she needed to be. Tonight was one of those nights. After 3 months of grueling training exercises in the mountains, she just wanted a quiet drink and some time to think about the new assignment waiting for her on Monday morning. The bar was exactly what she expected from a military town establishment, dimly lit, filled with smoke and the sound of clinking glasses, and packed with young soldiers blowing off steam after a long week. Sarah found an empty stool at the far end of the bar, ordered a beer, and tried to disappear into the shadows. She was small for a soldier, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with delicate features that made her look younger than her years. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a plain gray sweater that hung loosely on her slight frame. To anyone looking, she might have been a college student or maybe a local office worker grabbing a drink after work. That was exactly the impression she gave to the group of young recruits who had claimed the center of the bar as their territory for the evening. There were 6 of them, all fresh out of basic training, their new uniforms still crisp, and their confidence still untested by real military life. They were loud, boisterous, and full of the kind of bravado that comes from surviving boot camp and thinking you know everything about being a soldier. "Look at that girl over there," laughed Private Jake Morrison, a tall, muscular young man from Texas with a crew cut and a cocky grin. He nudged his buddy Marcus, pointing discreetly toward Sarah. "But she's never even held a gun in her life." The group erupted in laughter. They had been drinking for 2 hours, celebrating their upcoming deployment to their first real assignment, and their inhibitions were long gone. What started as casual observation quickly turned into a game of mockery. "She looks like she'd faint if someone said boo too loud," added Private Lisa Chun, no relation to Sarah, despite sharing the same last name. Lisa was trying hard to fit in with a male-dominated group, often being the loudest and crudest of them all. Probably never seen anything more dangerous than a paper cut. Private Rodriguez, a stocky young man from California, took a long swig of his beer and shook his head. "That's the problem with this generation. Soft. No backbone. Can you imagine her trying to make it through basic training? She'd wash out on day 1. The comments grew louder and more pointed as the alcohol flowed. They began making up elaborate scenarios about how Sarah would handle various military situations, each one more ridiculous and insulting than the last. They imagined her crying during weapons training, getting lost on a simple navigation exercise, or fainting at the sight of blood during first aid practice. Sarah heard every word. Her jaw clenched tighter with each comment, but she remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead at her reflection in the mirror behind the bar. She had dealt with this kind of attitude her entire military career. Being young, small, and female in a male-dominated profession meant constantly proving herself to people who had already decided she didn't belong. The bartender, an older man with graying hair and kind eyes, noticed the tension building. He had seen this scenario play out too many times before. "You okay, miss?" he asked quietly, refilling her glass. Sarah nodded without looking at him. "I'm fine," she said softly. Her voice was calm, controlled, but there was steel underneath that the bartender recognized immediately. He had been a military man himself once, and he knew that tone. The recruits, emboldened by alcohol and their own perceived superiority, decided to take their harassment to the next level. Private Morrison stood up, swaying slightly, and walked over to where Sarah was sitting. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, leaning against the bar next to her. His voice was loud enough for his friends to hear, and they all turned to watch the show. "You look a little out of place in here. This is kind of a military bar, you know? Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Sarah slowly turned to look at him. Her dark eyes were calm, almost serene, but there was something in them that made the bartender take a step back. Morrison, however, was too drunk and too confident to notice. "I'm sorry, did I do something to offend you?" Sarah asked politely. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, which only encouraged Morrison's friends to laugh louder. "Oh, listen to that," called out Marcus from across the bar. "She's got manners. That's cute." Morrison grinned, feeling like he was winning some kind of contest. "Nah, you didn't offend me, honey. I just think maybe you wandered into the wrong place. This isn't really somewhere for—" He looked her up and down dismissively, "civilians." The word civilians was said with such contempt that even some of the other patrons in the bar began to take notice. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had spent the last 10 years of her life serving her country, had seen combat in 3 different theaters, had lost friends and soldiers under her command, and had earned every stripe and medal through blood, sweat, and sacrifice that these children couldn't even imagine. But she said nothing. Not yet. Maybe I should buy you a drink, Morrison continued, his confidence growing with every laugh from his friends. Something sweet, like a cosmopolitan, or maybe a wine cooler. That seems more your speed. Actually, Sarah said quietly, I'm fine with beer. But thank you for the offer. This response seemed to confuse Morrison for a moment. He had expected her to either get angry and storm out, or maybe even be grateful for his attention. Her calm acceptance threw him off his game. Private Lisa Chun decided to jump in to help her friend. She walked over, drink in hand, and looked Sarah up and down with obvious disdain. You know, Lisa said, I think what Jake is trying to say is that this isn't really a place for people who don't understand military life. We work hard, we fight hard, and we play hard. It's not something everyone can handle. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense, she said. Military life is definitely challenging. Lisa smirked, thinking she had made her point. Exactly. It takes a special kind of person to serve. You have to be strong, both physically and mentally. You have to be able to make life and death decisions under pressure. You have to earn the respect of your fellow soldiers. Respect, Sarah repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. Yes, that's very important in the military. The conversation was beginning to attract attention from other parts of the bar. Several older soldiers, veterans who had been quietly drinking in corners, were starting to pay attention to what was happening. They could sense something in Sarah's demeanor that the young recruits were missing entirely. Morrison, feeling like he was losing control of the situation, decided to push harder. Look, I don't want to be mean here, but you just don't look like someone who could handle real military training. Have you ever even been camping? Do you know how to start a fire without matches? Could you march 20 miles with a full pack? Sarah took a slow sip of her beer and considered the question seriously. Those are all important skills, she agreed. Though I think the 20-mile march might be more challenging than the fire starting. The recruits burst into laughter again. To them, her response confirmed everything they had been saying. She was just a soft civilian who had no idea what military life was really like. But the older soldiers in the bar were beginning to exchange glances. Something about Sarah's calm responses, her complete lack of intimidation in the face of 6 aggressive young soldiers, was setting off alarm bells in their experienced minds. Rodriguez decided to join the pile-on. I bet she's never even held a rifle, he said loudly. Probably doesn't know the difference between an M4 and an AK-47, or the difference between a lieutenant and a sergeant, added another recruit, whose name was Williams. Sarah nodded again. Military ranks can definitely be confusing, she said, especially when you're just starting out. This comment sent the recruits into another round of laughter and high fives. They were having the time of their lives, completely convinced that they were educating some poor civilian girl about the realities of military service. The bartender, however, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. He had served for 20 years before retiring and opening the bar, and something about Sarah's behavior was familiar. The way she held herself, the way she spoke with such careful precision, the complete absence of fear or anger despite being outnumbered and harassed, it all reminded him of something. Ma'am, he said quietly, leaning across the bar towards Sarah. Can I get you anything else? Sarah looked at him and smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had shown all evening, and it transformed her entire face. Actually, she said, could I get a glass of water? I think I might have had enough beer for tonight. The bartender nodded and quickly filled a glass with ice water, setting it down in front of her. As he did, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On Sarah's left wrist, partially hidden by her sweater sleeve, was a small tattoo. It was the insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division, with 2 small stars underneath it. His eyes met Sarah's, and she gave him the slightest nod. The bartender stepped back, his face pale. He knew exactly what those stars meant. Meanwhile, the recruits were still having their fun. Morrison had moved even closer to Sarah, close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath. His friends were egging him on, suggesting increasingly inappropriate comments and actions. You know what I think? Morrison said, his voice getting louder and more slurred. I think you should stick around. We could teach you a few things about what real soldiers are like. The suggestion was met with cheers from his friends, but also with uncomfortable silence from the rest of the bar. The older veterans were no longer pretending not to listen. They were watching intently, and several had moved closer to the bar. Sarah finished her water and carefully set the glass down on the bar. She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, placing it next to the glass. "That's very kind of you to offer," she said to Morrison, "but I think I should probably head home. I have an early day tomorrow." She stood up from her stool, and for a moment, it looked like the confrontation might be over. The recruits seemed satisfied that they had successfully intimidated her into leaving. But as Sarah gathered her jacket, Morrison made a crucial mistake. He reached out and grabbed her arm. "Hold on there," he said, his grip tight enough to be painful. "I wasn't done talking to you yet." It's rude to walk away when someone's trying to have a conversation. The bar went completely silent. Sarah looked down at Morrison's hand on her arm, then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. For the first time all evening, her calm facade cracked just slightly, and Morrison got a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze. "I would suggest," Sarah said very quietly, "that you remove your hand from my arm." There was something in her voice now, an edge that cut through the alcohol-induced fog in Morrison's brain. But he was too committed to back down now, especially with his friends watching. "Or what?" he challenged, tightening his grip. Sarah's response was so fast that most people in the bar missed it. One moment Morrison was holding her arm, and the next he was on the ground, his own arm twisted behind his back in a hold that had him crying out in pain. Sarah was kneeling beside him, her knee pressed against his back, her grip on his arm firm but controlled. Her voice was still quiet, still calm, but now everyone in the bar could hear the authority in it. "When someone asks you to let go of them," she said clearly, "the appropriate response is to let go immediately. Do you understand?" Morrison was gasping, his face pressed against the dirty floor of the bar. "Yes," he managed to choke out. "Yes, I understand." Sarah held the position for exactly 3 seconds longer, making sure the lesson was clear, then released him and stood up. Morrison scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and pain, his friends staring in shocked silence. "Now," Sarah said, smoothing down her sweater and picking up her jacket, "I'm going to leave. And I would suggest that all of you think carefully about how you treat people in the future. You never know who you might be talking to." She walked toward the door of the bar, the crowd parting to let her through. Every eye in the place was on her, but she moved with the same calm confidence she had shown all evening. Just as she reached the door, she paused and turned back to face the group of recruits. They were still standing in stunned silence around Morrison, who was rubbing his sore arm and looking like he wanted to disappear. "Oh, and one more thing," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent bar. "You might want to work on your military knowledge before you start lecturing people about it. An M4 carbine fires 5.56 millimeters NATO rounds at approximately 900 rounds per minute with an effective range of 500 meters. An AK-47 fires 7.62 millimeters Soviet rounds at approximately 600 rounds per minute with an effective range of 300 meters. The difference is significant in combat situations." She paused, letting that sink in. "Also, a lieutenant outranks a sergeant. I would hope you'd learn that before you meet your commanding officers on Monday." With that, she pushed open the door and walked out into the rain, leaving behind a bar full of people who were just beginning to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The recruits stood in stunned silence for a full minute after Sarah left. Morrison was still rubbing his arm, his face a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and growing realization. The easy confidence they had all shared just moments before had evaporated completely. It was Rodriguez who finally broke the silence. "Did she just—" he started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Did she just do some kind of martial arts move on Jake?" Lisa finished for him, her voice small and uncertain. The bartender, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with growing recognition, finally spoke up. "You kids might want to sit down," he said quietly, "and maybe order some coffee." Williams, who had been the quietest of the group all evening, sank into the nearest chair. "She knew about the guns," he said slowly. "She knew the exact specifications. The rate of fire, the ammunition, the range. That's not information you just pick up from watching movies." Marcus, who had been one of the loudest in mocking Sarah, was beginning to look sick. "And the way she moved," he said, "that wasn't lucky. That was training. Real training." Morrison finally found his voice again. She could have hurt me, he said, his voice shaky. She could have really hurt me, but she didn't. She just made her point. The older veterans in the bar were beginning to approach their table. Sergeant First Class retired Tom Brady, a grizzled man in his 50s with Vietnam-era tattoos covering his arms, pulled up a chair. "Boys," he said, his voice serious, "I think you might have just made a very big mistake." Lisa looked up at him with frightened eyes. "What do you mean?" Brady exchanged glances with the bartender, who nodded grimly. "That young lady you were harassing? I've seen her type before. The way she carried herself, the way she responded to aggression, the way she knew to end a confrontation without causing permanent damage. That's advanced military training. Special Forces level training." The color drained from Rodriguez's face. "You think she was military?" "I don't think," Brady said flatly. "I know. Question is, what kind of military and what rank?" The bartender came over, carrying a pot of coffee and several mugs. As he set them down, he looked at each of the young recruits in turn. "I saw her tattoo," he said quietly. 82nd Airborne, with 2 stars underneath. Brady whistled low. 82nd Airborne doesn't take just anybody, and stars under the unit insignia usually mean deployments. Combat de promo. Morrison felt like he was going to be sick. The adrenaline from the confrontation was wearing off, and reality was beginning to set in. "How many deployments do you think?" he asked weakly. "Hard to say without seeing it clearly," Brady replied. "But if she's as young as she looks, and she's already got multiple combat deployments with an elite unit, that suggests she's either very good at what she does or very unlucky. Maybe both." Williams put his head in his hands. "We're supposed to report to our new unit on Monday," he said. "What if she—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone knew what he was thinking. What if the woman they had spent the evening mocking and harassing was somehow connected to their new assignment? "Where are you kids being stationed?" Brady asked. Lisa answered in a barely audible whisper. "Fort Bragg. We're being assigned to the 82nd Airborne." The silence that followed that revelation was deafening. Brady and the bartender exchanged another look, and this time Brady actually smiled, though it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Fort Bragg," Brady repeated slowly. 82nd Airborne. "Well, that's interesting." Morrison looked up at him with desperate eyes. "What's interesting about it?" Brady leaned back in his chair, enjoying the irony of the situation. "Fort Bragg is home to the 82nd Airborne Division. It's also where they train and station some of the most elite soldiers in military. If that young lady has a tattoo indicating multiple deployments with that unit, and she's heading back there," he let the implication hang in the air. Rodriguez was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "You think she might be stationed there too?" "I think," Brady said slowly, "that you 6 might want to spend the rest of the weekend learning how to apologize properly. Because there's a very good chance you're going to see her again." The recruits spent the rest of the evening in the bar, but the party atmosphere was completely gone. They drank coffee, sobered up, and tried to process what had happened. The more they talked about it, the more obvious it became that they had made a terrible error in judgment. Sarah's calm demeanor under harassment, her complete lack of intimidation, her knowledge of military weapons and procedures, her combat training, it all pointed to one conclusion that none of them wanted to face. They had spent the evening mocking and harassing someone who was almost certainly their superior in both training and experience. Someone who might very well be in a position to make their military careers very difficult. As the night wore on, and they began to truly comprehend the magnitude of their mistake, each of them made a silent promise to themselves. If they ever saw Sarah again, if they ever got the chance, they would apologize for their behavior and hope that she was the kind of person who believed in second chances. What none of them knew, as they sat in that bar nursing their coffee and their wounded pride, was that in less than 48 hours, they would have their chance. And the circumstances under which they would see Sarah again would be far worse than anything their alcohol-dulled imaginations could have conceived that night. Monday morning arrived gray and cold at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The 6 recruits who had spent their weekend in an agony of worry and regret stood in formation with 40 other new soldiers, waiting for their first briefing at their new assignment. The previous 48 hours had been the longest of their lives. After leaving Murphy's Bar on Friday night, they had spent Saturday and Sunday researching everything they could find about the 82nd Airborne Division, combat deployments, and military protocols for dealing with superior officers. What they learned only made their situation seem worse. The 82nd Airborne was known as the All-American Division an elite rapid deployment force that had seen action in every major conflict since World War II. Soldiers assigned to the unit were among the most highly trained in the military, and the division had a reputation for excellence that was legendary throughout the armed forces. Morrison had barely slept since Friday night. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel Sarah's grip on his arm and hear the quiet authority in her voice as she corrected his knowledge of military weapons. The memory made him physically sick. Lisa Chun had spent the weekend writing and rewriting a letter of apology, trying to find words that could somehow make up for her behavior. But every draft seemed inadequate, and she had finally given up, hoping instead that they would never see Sarah again. Rodriguez had called his older brother a Marine veteran and confessed the whole story. His brother's response had been brief and brutal. "You're an idiot, and you better pray she's not your commanding officer." Williams had researched military discipline procedures and learned about the various ways a superior officer could make a subordinate's life miserable without technically violating any regulations. The possibilities were endless and terrifying. Marcus had tried to convince himself that it was all a coincidence, that Sarah couldn't possibly be stationed at Fort Bragg, that they would never see her again. But deep down, he knew better. And Private Jackson, who had been the quietest member of their group at the bar, but had still participated in the mockery, had spent the weekend in a state of near panic, convinced that their military careers were over before they had even really begun. Now, standing in formation in the cold morning air, all 6 of them scanned every face they could see, dreading the moment when they might spot a familiar figure. The base was enormous, home to nearly 30,000 soldiers and support personnel. Fort Bragg sprawled across more than 160,000 acres of North Carolina pine forest, with hundreds of buildings, training facilities, airfields, and housing areas. The chances of running into any specific person seemed small. That thought provided little comfort to the 6 recruits as they waited for their briefing to begin. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres stood at the front of the formation, a clipboard in his hand and an expression of professional boredom on his face. He was a career soldier, 15 years in the Army, and he had seen thousands of new recruits come through Fort Bragg. Most of them thought they were tough until they discovered what real military training actually involved. "Listen up," Torres called out, his voice carrying easily across the formation. "Welcome to Fort Bragg, home of the 82nd Airborne Division. For the next few weeks, you will be completing advanced infantry training and airborne qualification. Some of you will make it. Some of you will not." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the formation of new soldiers. "Your training will be conducted by some of the most experienced combat veterans in the military. These instructors have seen action in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and other locations that remain classified. They have earned their positions through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, and they demand the same level of commitment from every soldier under their command." Morrison felt his stomach drop. Combat vétéran. Instructors who had earned their positions through blood and sacrifice. It sounded exactly like Sarah. Torres continued his briefing, outlining the training schedule, base policies, and expectations for the new recruits. But the 6 friends weren't really listening anymore. They were too busy scanning the area for any sign of the woman who had completely demolished their confidence 3 nights ago. "Your primary instructor for advanced weapons training and close combat will be arriving shortly," Torres said. "Captain Sarah Chun has just returned from her 3rd deployment overseas and will be taking over this training cycle." The world seemed to stop. Morrison felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Lisa Chun, who shared the same last name as their tormentor, went completely pale. Rodriguez actually swayed on his feet and had to lock his knees to keep from falling over. "Captain, Sarah Chun." Captain was a high-ranking officer. Captain meant she had been in the military for years, had earned her position through exactly the kind of combat experience Torres had just described. Captain meant she had authority over every single person in this formation. "Did he say Captain Chun?" Williams whispered, barely breathing. "3rd deployment," Marcus added in a voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. Jackson looked like he was about to faint. "We mocked a captain," he said. "We harassed a captain who just got back from combat deployment." But Lisa Chun was staring at Torres with a look of dawning horror. "Same last name," she whispered. "Oh God, what if she remembers that I said we weren't related? What if she thinks I was lying?" Before anyone could respond to that terrifying possibility, Torres called the formation to attention. "Captain Chun is approaching. You will show proper respect and military courtesy at all times. The six friends stood rigidly at attention, their eyes locked straight ahead, not daring to look around for fear of what they might see. But they could hear footsteps approaching, the crisp sound of military boots on pavement. The footsteps stopped somewhere behind the formation. There was a brief, whispered conversation between Torres and someone else, but the words were too quiet to make out. "Company attention," Torres barked. "About face." As one, the entire formation turned around. And there, standing next to Staff Sergeant Torres in full military uniform, was Sarah Chun. But this was not the same woman they had seen in the bar on Friday night. Gone was the civilian clothing, the ponytail, the deliberately unremarkable appearance. Captain Chin stood in crisp Army combat uniform, her hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her posture straight and commanding. Her uniform was decorated with ribbons and badges that told the story of her service. Expert Marksmanship Badge, Paratrooper Wings, Combat Infantry Badge, Bronze Star with V device for Valor, Purple Heart. She looked every inch the combat veteran that she was. But what struck the six recruits most was her eyes. The same dark eyes that had remained calm and controlled while they mocked her, that had shown just a flash of steel when Morrison grabbed her arm. Now those eyes swept methodically across the formation, taking in every face, every detail. Morrison tried to make himself invisible, staring straight ahead and hoping desperately that Captain Chin wouldn't recognize him. But he could feel her gaze when it reached him, could feel it pause for just a moment longer than it had on the other soldiers. Then her eyes moved on to Lisa Chun, and there was definitely recognition there. Lisa felt her knees go weak and had to concentrate on not collapsing. One by one, Captain Chin's gaze found each of the six recruits who had spent Friday night convinced of their own superiority. Rodriguez, Williams, Marcus, Jackson. Each time her eyes paused, just for a second, just long enough to let them know that she remembered. When she had finished her survey of the formation, Captain Chun stepped forward. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the group. It was the same voice they remembered from the bar, but now it carried the unmistakable authority of command. "I am Captain Chun, and I will be your primary instructor for the next phase of your training." She paused, clasping her hands behind her back in a classic military stance. "Some of you may be wondering about my qualifications to train you. I have been in the United States Army for 10 years. I have completed 3 combat deployments, 2 to Afghanistan and 1 to Syria. I have led soldiers in combat operations, and I have law soldiers under my command. I have earned every rank, every ribbon, and every badge you see on this uniform." Morrison was sweating now, despite the cool morning air. Every word Captain Chin spoke was like a hammer blow, emphasizing just how badly he had misjudged her on Friday night. "During your time under my instruction," Captain Chun continued, "you will learn advanced weapons handling, close quarters combat, tactical movement, and survival techniques. These are not academic subjects. These are skills that will keep you and your fellow soldiers alive in combat situations." She began walking slowly along the front of the formation, her eyes making contact with each soldier as she passed. Military training is not a game. It is not an opportunity to prove how tough you think you are. It is preparation for situations where your life and the lives of others will depend on your knowledge, your skills, and your ability to follow orders without question. As she walked, Captain Chin's path took her directly in front of the 6 recruits who were now wishing they could disappear entirely. When she reached Morrison, she stopped. "Some of you," she said, looking directly at him, "may have preconceived notions about military service, about what it means to be a soldier, about who belongs in the military and who doesn't." Morrison tried to swallow, but his mouth was completely dry. Captain Chin's gaze was steady, professional, but he could see something else underneath. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold assessment that was somehow worse. "I want to make something very clear," Captain Chin said, addressing the entire formation, but still looking at Morrison. "In the military, you earn respect through your actions, not your assumptions. You prove your worth through your performance, not your prejudices. And you show your character through how you treat others, especially those you perceive as different from yourself." She moved on, stopping next in front of Lisa Chun. "Some of you may think that sharing a name with your instructor gives you some kind of advantage," she said. "Let me assure you that it does not. In my training program, every soldier is evaluated on their own merits, regardless of any perceived connections. Lisa felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but managed to keep them in check. Captain Chin moved on without another word. When she reached Rodriguez, she paused again. Military service requires mental discipline as well as physical strength. The ability to control your impulses, to think before you speak, to consider the consequences of your actions. These are not optional skills for a soldier. Rodriguez was trembling slightly, but managed to keep his position at attention. Captain Chun continued her walk past Williams, Marcus, and Jackson, stopping briefly in front of each one. But she didn't speak again until she had returned to the center of the formation. Your training begins now, she announced. You will be divided into squads and assigned to different training rotations. Excellence is expected. Anything less will result in additional training until you meet the required standards. She nodded to Staff Sergeant Torres, who stepped forward with his clipboard. When your name is called, fall out and report to your assigned training area, Torres said. First squad, Morrison, L. Chun, Rodriguez, Williams, Marcus, Jackson. The 6 friends exchanged glances of pure terror. They were being assigned to the same squad, Captain Chen's squad. As their names were called, they fell out of formation and assembled in a small group to the side. Captain Chen approached them, now carrying a clipboard of her own and wearing an expression of professional detachment. First squad, she said, looking at each of them in turn. You will be with me for advanced weapons training this morning. Follow me. She turned and began walking toward one of the training buildings, her pace brisk and military. The 6 recruits followed, their minds racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. The weapons training facility was a long, low building that housed an indoor firing range, weapons storage, and several classrooms for theoretical instruction. Captain Chun led them to one of the classrooms and gestured for them to take seats at the rectangular table that dominated the room. For a moment, she just stood at the front of the room, looking at them. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Finally, Morrison couldn't stand it anymore. Ma'am, he said, his voice hoarse with nervousness, we owe you an apology. Captain Chin raised an eyebrow. Do you? Yes, ma'am. Morrison continued, encouraged by the fact that she hadn't immediately shut him down. Our behavior on Friday night was completely inappropriate. We made assumptions about you that were wrong, and we treated you with disrespect. There's no excuse for what we did. The others quickly joined in, voices overlapping as they tried to express their regret and shame. We're sorry, Captain, Lisa said. We were drunk, but that's not an excuse. We didn't know you were military, Rodriguez added. Not that it matters. We shouldn't have acted that way regardless. We were wrong about everything, Williams said. We're really sorry. Captain Chin listened to their apologies without interrupting, her expression unchanged. When they finished speaking, she was quiet for another long moment. You're sorry, she said finally. That's good. Regret means you understand that you made a mistake. But I'm more interested in whether you understand what that mistake actually was. She moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room and picked up a marker. Tell me, she said, looking at Morrison, what exactly are you apologizing for? Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For making fun of you? For treating you badly? Captain Chun wrote harassment on the board. What else? For assuming you weren't military, Lisa offered. Assumptions, Captain Chun wrote. Continue. For grabbing your arm, Morrison said, his face burning with embarrassment. Assault, Captain Chun wrote, and Morrison winced at the harsh word. For being drunk and stupid, Rodriguez said. Captain Chun paused, marker in hand. Alcohol impairs judgment, but it doesn't create character flaws. It reveals them. What else? The room fell silent. The recruits looked at each other, unsure what other confessions Captain Chin was looking for. Let me help you, Captain Chin said. She turned back to the board and wrote prejudice in large letters. You didn't treat me badly because you were drunk. You didn't assume I was a civilian because of the alcohol. You acted the way you did because you saw a small, young, female person and decided that I couldn't possibly be a soldier. She underlined the word prejudice twice. You made judgments about my capabilities based on my appearance. You decided I was weak because I'm small. You assumed I was ignorant because I'm female. You treated me as lesser because I didn't fit your preconceived notion of what a soldier should look like. The truth of her words hit each of them like a physical blow. They had been operating under assumptions they hadn't even been conscious of. Now, Captain Chun continued, here's what's going to happen. You're going to spend the next several weeks in my training program. I'm going to push you harder than you have ever been pushed before. You're going to learn skills that require precision, discipline, and mental toughness. And at the end of this training, you're going to be better soldiers." She paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "But understand this. I'm not doing this because I'm angry with you. I'm not trying to punish you for Friday night. I'm doing this because it's my job to prepare you for combat, and combat doesn't care about your assumptions or prejudices. Combat doesn't care if you think someone looks too small or too weak or too different to be a soldier. Combat will kill you if you're not prepared." Captain Shin set down her marker and faced them fully. "In Afghanistan, I served with a medic who was barely 5 feet tall and looked like she could be blown away by a strong wind. She saved the lives of 12 soldiers during a Taliban ambush, including carrying a wounded soldier twice her size to safety while under heavy fire. She received the Silver Star for her actions." She walked closer to the table where they were sitting. "I served with a soldier who had a thick Southern accent and came from a family of farmers. He spoke slowly, and some people assumed he wasn't very smart. He had a degree in engineering from Georgia Tech and could disarm an IED faster than anyone I've ever seen. His technical expertise saved my life and the lives of every soldier in my unit." Captain Shun pulled out a chair and sat down across from them. "I'm telling you these stories because I want you to understand something important. The military has no room for prejudice. In combat, the person next to you might be male or female, tall or short, white or black or brown, Christian or Muslim or atheist, straight or gay, rural or urban. None of that matters. What matters is whether they can do their job when lives are on the line." She leaned forward slightly. "Friday night, you demonstrated that you are not ready for that reality. You show that you still think of military service in terms of stereotypes and assumptions. That kind of thinking will get you killed. More importantly, it will get other soldiers killed." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. None of the recruits spoke, but all of them were beginning to understand the true magnitude of what they had revealed about themselves. "So here's what we're going to do," Captain Chin said, standing up again. "We're going to train. We're going to train until you are competent with every weapon system in the Army inventory. We're going to train until you can navigate in the dark, in the rain, in terrain you've never seen before. We're going to train until you can function effectively under stress, under pressure, under conditions that would have sent you running for help a few weeks ago." She walked to a locked cabinet and began entering a combination. "And while we train, you're going to learn to see your fellow soldiers as individuals, not stereotypes. You're going to learn to respect competence regardless of what package it comes in. You're going to learn that assumptions are luxury you cannot afford in military service." The cabinet opened, revealing an array of weapons, all secured with cable locks. "Because someday," Captain Sean said, selecting an M4 carbine and checking to ensure it was unloaded, "you may find yourself in a situation where your life depends on a soldier who doesn't look like what you think a soldier should look like. And when that day comes, I want you to be smart enough to be grateful for their training, their courage, and their dedication, instead of standing there wondering why they don't match your expectations." She set the weapon on the table in front of them. "Now," she said, "let's begin your education." The next 6 weeks were the most challenging period in the lives of all 6 recruits. Captain Shun proved to be exactly the kind of instructor they should have expected based on her military record, demanding, knowledgeable, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to standards. But she was also fair. Despite their fears that she would use her position to punish them for the incident at Murphy's Bar, Captain Shin treated them exactly the same as every other soldier in her training program. She pushed them hard because she pushed everyone hard. She corrected their mistakes because correction was necessary for improvement. She demanded excellence because excellence was the only acceptable standard. Morrison was the first to realize that Captain Chin's treatment of them had nothing to do with personal revenge and everything to do with professional duty. During their second week of weapons training, he made a careless error while cleaning his rifle, leaving a small amount of debris in the bolt mechanism. When Captain Chun discovered the mistake during inspection, she made him disassemble and clean the weapon 6 times in a row until he could do it perfectly. "In combat," she explained as he worked, "a dirty weapon can jam at exactly the wrong moment. That jam could cost you your life or the life of the soldier next to you. There is no such thing as close enough when it comes to weapons maintenance." Morrison expected anger or sarcasm in her voice, some indication that she was enjoying his discomfort. Instead, he heard only the patient tone of an experienced instructor teaching a crucial lesson. It was then that he began to understand the difference between punishment and training. Rodriguez learned the same lesson during hand-to-hand combat instruction. Still influenced by his assumptions about size and strength, he didn't take Captain Chin's technical demonstration seriously. When she asked for a volunteer to demonstrate a defensive technique, he stepped forward with confidence, certain that his size advantage would protect him from any hold she might attempt. 30 seconds later, he was on the ground for the second time in 2 weeks, this time in front of his entire training class. Combat is not about size or strength, Captain Chun said as she helped him to his feet. It's about technique, training, and tactical thinking. A smaller opponent who knows what they're doing will defeat a larger opponent who relies only on physical advantages. Every time, she had Rodriguez practice the same defensive movement 50 times that afternoon, correcting his form and explaining the principles behind each technique. By the end of the session, he could execute the movement properly, and more importantly, he understood why it worked. Lisa Chun faced her own challenges in learning to see past her assumptions. During their 3rd week, Captain Chun assigned her partner with a recruit named Private Thomas Kim, a quiet young man who spoke with a heavy accent and seemed to struggle with some of the more technical aspects of their training. Lisa's initial reaction was frustration. She had been working hard to prove herself, and being partnered with someone who might slow her down felt like a setback. But Captain Chun seemed to have anticipated this reaction. "Private Chun," she said, "I want you to help Private Kim with radio communication procedures. You'll be evaluated on how well you can teach the material, not just how well you understand it yourself." The assignment forced Lisa to really listen to Kim's questions and understand his perspective. What she discovered was that his struggles had nothing to do with intelligence or capability. Kim was a first-generation American whose family had immigrated from South Korea when he was 12. His accent didn't reflect a lack of education. He spoke 3 languages fluently and had graduated near the top of his engineering program at Virginia Tech. His difficulties with radio protocols had to do with specific military terminology and acronyms that weren't intuitive to someone who had learned English as a second language. Once Lisa understood the real nature of his challenges, she was able to help him master the material quickly. More importantly, she learned that her initial assumptions about Kim's capabilities had been completely wrong. During a later navigation exercise, Kim's technical skills and attention to detail proved invaluable, and he ended up leading their team to a faster completion time than any other group in the class. Williams, Marcus, and Jackson each had their own moments of realization as the training progressed. Williams discovered that a female soldier named Martinez could outshoot him consistently on the rifle range, despite his previous assumptions about women and firearms. Marcus learned that Davis, a soldier from rural Mississippi whose slow speech had made Marcus assume he was uneducated, had actually memorized the technical specifications of every weapon system they studied and could recite them with perfect accuracy. Jackson found his assumptions challenged when he was paired with Thompson, a soldier who was openly gay and whom Jackson had initially avoided based on his own prejudices. Thompson proved to be one of the most dedicated and reliable members of their training class, and when Jackson injured his ankle during a training exercise, Thompson carried his pack for the last 3 miles of their march without being asked and without complaint. But the most significant transformation came during their 5th week of training, when Captain Chin announced that they would be participating in a 3-day field exercise designed to test everything they had learned. "You'll be divided into 2 teams," she explained to the assembled class. "Each team will be given a set of objectives to complete within the time limit. The team that completes their objectives most efficiently and with the fewest mistakes will be granted weekend leave. The losing team will spend the weekend in additional training." The prospect of weekend leave was enormously motivating. It had been over a month since any of them had been off base, and the chance to relax, visit family, or simply sleep in their own beds was incredibly appealing. Captain Chun divided the class into 2 equal teams. By pure chance, or perhaps by careful design, Morrison, Rodriguez, Lisa, Williams, Marcus, and Jackson all ended up on the same team, along with Kim, Martinez, Davis, Thompson, and 2 other soldiers. Their team leader was designated as Sergeant Williams, the most senior member of the group, but it quickly became clear that effective leadership would require input and cooperation from everyone. The exercise began before dawn on Friday morning. Each team was given a series of coordinates marking locations they needed to reach, tasks they needed to complete at each location, and a final extraction point where they needed to arrive by Sunday afternoon. The first day went reasonably well. Both teams completed their initial objectives and established their overnight positions without major problems. But the second day brought unexpected challenges that would test not just their technical skills, but their ability to work together under pressure. The weather turned bad overnight, with heavy rain that made navigation more difficult and stream crossings dangerous. Worse, during the night, Private Thompson had developed what appeared to be food poisoning, possibly from contaminated water despite their purification procedures. Thompson was clearly ill, running a fever, experiencing nausea, and unable to keep food down, but he insisted that he could continue with the exercise. The team faced a difficult decision: push Thompson to keep going and risk his health getting worse, or slow down their pace to accommodate his condition and risk losing the competition. It was Jackson who spoke up first. "Thompson can't keep going like this," he said. "We need to take care of him." 6 weeks earlier, Jackson would never have advocated for slowing down the team to help Thompson. His prejudices would have made him view Thompson as a liability rather than a teammate. But the training had changed his perspective in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Jackson's right," Rodriguez agreed. "We're not leaving anyone behind." Lisa looked at the map and calculated their remaining objectives. "If we modify our route slightly, we can find a more sheltered location to rest during the heat of the day. That might give Thompson time to recover." Morrison, who had developed considerable respect for Captain Chen's strategic thinking, tried to imagine what she would do in their situation. "In real combat, we call for medical evacuation," he said. "But this is training. The question is, what's more important, winning the exercise or taking care of our teammate?" It was Marcus who provided the answer. "If we were in real combat and one of our team members was sick, we wouldn't abandon him to complete the mission faster. We'd find a way to do both." They spent the next hour developing a modified plan. Davis, whose engineering background made him excellent at problem solving, suggested a route that would allow them to complete most of their objectives while providing Thompson with opportunities to rest. Kim offered to carry Thompson's pack in addition to his own. Martinez volunteered to take point and set a sustainable pace. The plan worked. Thompson's condition stabilized, and by Saturday evening, he was feeling well enough to carry his own gear again. More importantly, the team had learned to function as a cohesive unit, making decisions based on collective welfare rather than individual advantage. But the real test came on Sunday morning, when they reached their final objective, a mock combat scenario where they would have to work together to neutralize an enemy position and extract a wounded soldier. The scenario was complex, requiring coordinated movement, effective communication, and precise execution of the tactical procedures they had been learning. Each team member had a specific role to play, and the success of the mission depended on everyone performing their tasks correctly. As they approached the objective area, Rodriguez spotted movement in the trees ahead. Using hand signals they had practiced extensively, he communicated the enemy position to the rest of the team. Davis moved to provide covering fire, while Kim set up the radio equipment to call for support. Martinez and Williams flanked the position from opposite sides. Morrison and Jackson were designated as the extraction team, responsible for reaching the wounded soldier and carrying him to safety. Lisa was assigned as backup, ready to fill whatever role became necessary. The exercise required them to work together with a level of trust and coordination that would have been impossible 6 weeks earlier. Morrison had to trust that Davis could provide accurate covering fire. Rodriguez had to trust that Martinez and Williams could execute their flanking maneuvers without exposing the team to unnecessary risk. Everyone had to trust that Kim could manage the communication systems effectively under pressure. And Jackson had to trust Thompson, who despite his recent illness was assigned as his partner for the extraction, to watch his back while they moved into the most dangerous part of the scenario. The mission was executed flawlessly. Each team member performed their assigned role with precision and confidence. The enemy position was neutralized without any casualties, and the wounded soldier was successfully extracted to safety. When Captain Chun emerged from her observation position to debrief the exercise, her expression was unreadable. She made notes on her clipboard as she examined the scenario area, checked their radio logs, and reviewed their tactical decisions. "Gather round," she said finally. Both teams assembled in a circle around her, tired but eager to hear the results of the 3-day exercise. First, let me say that both teams performed well overall. Captain Chen began. You demonstrated tactical knowledge, physical endurance, and problem-solving abilities. Both teams completed all assigned objectives within the time limit. The soldiers exchanged glances, trying to guess from her tone which team had won. However, Captain Chen continued. This exercise was not just about completing objectives. It was about demonstrating the qualities that make soldiers effective in real combat situations: adaptability, teamwork, and the understanding that mission success means bringing everyone home alive. She looked directly at the 6 former bar patrons and their teammates. One team modified their plan when a team member became ill, taking on extra burdens to ensure that no one was left behind. They demonstrated that they understand the most important principle of military service: you never abandon your fellow soldiers. Williams felt his heart jump. It sounded like Captain Chen was describing their team's handling of Thompson's illness. The other team, Captain Chen continued, made a different choice. When one of their members showed signs of fatigue and dehydration, they encouraged him to push through it and maintain their original timeline. They completed their objectives quickly, but they did so by prioritizing speed over the welfare of their teammates. She paused, letting the implications sink in. In real combat, that choice could have resulted in a soldier collapsing from heat exhaustion, becoming separated from the unit, or making mistakes due to impaired judgment. Mission success means nothing if you lose soldiers in the process. Morrison felt a surge of pride and relief. Their decision to slow down for Thompson hadn't been a weakness. It had been exactly what Captain Chen was looking for. The winning team, Captain Chen announced, demonstrated that they have learned the most important lesson of military service. Taking care of your fellow soldiers is not separate from mission success. It is the foundation of mission success. The celebration was subdued but heartfelt. As they gathered their gear and prepared for the journey back to base, Morrison found himself walking next to Captain Chen. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "thank you." She looked at him questioningly. "For what, Private?" "For teaching us what we really needed to learn," Morrison replied. 6 weeks ago, we thought being a soldier was about being tough and following orders. We didn't understand that it was about this. He gestured toward his teammates, who were helping Thompson with his pack and joking with Kim about his radio procedures. Captain Chen nodded slowly. "And what is this, Private Morrison?" Morrison thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. "It's about seeing each other clearly," he said finally. "Not the way we want them to be, or the way we expect them to be, but the way they actually are. And then working together based on that reality instead of our assumptions." "That's a good answer," Captain Chen said. "But remember, this is just the beginning. Learning to see past your prejudices in a controlled training environment is one thing. Maintaining that clarity under the stress of real combat is something else entirely." She paused, then added, "The soldiers I told you about, the medic who saved 12 lives, the engineer who disarmed IEDs, they were effective because their teammates saw them for who they really were, not what they looked like. But that took time, training, and experience working together under pressure." Morrison nodded, understanding that the lesson was far from over. That evening, back in their barracks, the 6 friends sat together reflecting on the exercise and the weeks of training that had led up to it. The atmosphere was completely different from their celebration at Murphy's Bar 6 weeks earlier. "I keep thinking about that first night," Lisa said. "How sure we were that we knew everything about being soldiers." Rodriguez shook his head. "We didn't know anything. We had no idea what we were talking about." "The worst part," Williams added, "is that we were so proud of our ignorance. We thought not knowing anything was something to brag about." Marcus had been quiet for most of the evening, but now he spoke up. "I've been thinking about this a lot," he said. "What if Captain Chen had been in civilian clothes, but she'd been a man? Same size, same age, just male instead of female. Would we have acted the same way?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable but necessary. "Probably not," Jackson admitted. "We would have assumed a small guy might know martial arts or might be military. We wouldn't have automatically assumed he was weak." "And if she'd been a large man?" Lisa asked. "We definitely would have been more careful about how we approached him." Morrison felt sick thinking about it. "So we harassed her specifically because she was a small woman. Not because of anything she did or said, but because of what she looked like." The realization was painful, but important. They had to face the truth about their own prejudices before they could really move past them. The thing is, Rodriguez said, we thought we were being funny. We thought we were just having harmless fun. We didn't think we were hurting anyone. But that's the point, isn't it? Williams replied. We didn't think about how she felt. We didn't consider that she might be a person with feelings, with dignity, with accomplishments we couldn't see. Kim, who had been listening to their conversation from his nearby bunk, spoke up. Can I say something? He asked. They nodded, and he sat up to face them. That first week of training, when you were all assigned to help me with radio procedures, I could tell that some of you thought I was going to slow you down. Not all of you, but some. I could see it in your faces. The admission was uncomfortable, but not surprising. But then you took the time to really understand what I was struggling with, Kim continued. You didn't just assume I was stupid or lazy. You figured out what the actual problem was and helped me solve it. That made all the difference. He paused, then added, I think that's what Captain Chin was trying to teach you. Not just about how to treat people better, but about how to see situations more clearly. Assumptions make you miss important information. Thompson joined the conversation from his bunk across the room. It's like what happened today with my illness, he said. 6 weeks ago. How would you have reacted? The question prompted honest self-reflection from all of them. 6 weeks ago, Jackson said slowly, I probably would have been frustrated that you were slowing us down. I might have suggested that you just needed to toughen up and push through it. And I probably would have supported that, Morrison added. I would have seen taking care of you as separate from completing the mission, not as part of it. But today, Rodriguez said, it never occurred to any of us to leave you behind. It wasn't even a question. Thompson smiled. That's growth. That's what good training does. It changes how you think about problems. As the conversation continued, each of them began to understand that their transformation over the past 6 weeks had been about much more than learning military skills. They had learned to see their fellow soldiers and themselves more clearly and more honestly. They had learned that competence comes in many different packages, that assumptions are dangerous in any situation that matters, and that true strength comes from working together effectively rather than trying to prove individual superiority. Most importantly, they had learned that the military values they thought they understood, honor, courage, duty, were much more complex and demanding than they had realized. Honor meant treating others with dignity, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. Courage meant being willing to examine and change your own prejudices. Duty meant taking responsibility not just for your own performance, but for the welfare of every member of your team. As they finally settled in for the night, Morrison thought about Captain Chin's final words during the exercise debrief. This was just the beginning. They had learned important lessons in a controlled environment, but the real test would come when they faced genuine challenges, real stress, actual danger. But for the first time since that humiliating night at Murphy's Bar, Morrison felt confident that they would be ready for whatever came next. Not because they had become perfect soldiers, but because they had learned to see clearly, think honestly, and work together effectively. And those skills he was beginning to understand were the foundation of everything else that mattered in military service. 3 months after the field exercise, the 6 recruits had completed their advanced training and were preparing for their first deployment overseas. The transformation in their attitudes and capabilities had been remarkable, but the true test of everything they had learned was about to begin. Their unit had been assigned to a forward operating base in Syria, where they would be conducting security patrols, convoy protection, and intelligence gathering operations in an active combat zone. Captain Chun would be leading the deployment as their company commander, with approximately 120 soldiers under her command. The week before deployment was filled with final preparations, equipment checks, and briefings on the specific challenges they would face in their area of operations. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a complex environment where threats could come from multiple directions and where cultural understanding would be just as important as tactical skills. During one of their final briefings, Captain Chun addressed the entire company about the realities they would face overseas. The enemy you'll encounter in Syria doesn't wear uniforms, she explained, standing before a detailed map of their operational area. They don't follow conventional military tactics, and they don't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Your ability to identify threats, work with local populations, and adapt to changing situations will determine not just the success of your missions, but whether you and your fellow soldiers come home alive. She clicked to the next slide, showing photos of the terrain they would be operating in. This deployment will test everything you've learned over the past several months. Your weapons skills, your tactical knowledge, your physical conditioning, all of that matters. But what will matter most is your ability to function as a cohesive team, to trust each other completely, and to make good decisions under pressure. Morrison raised his hand. Ma'am, what should we expect in terms of local cooperation? Captain Chin nodded approvingly at the question. That's exactly the kind of thinking you need to maintain over there. The local population is not our enemy, but they're also not necessarily our allies. They're people trying to survive in a very difficult situation. Some will help us, some will actively oppose us, and most will just try to avoid getting caught in the middle. She advanced to a slide showing pictures of Syrian civilians. Your ability to distinguish between genuine threats and innocent civilians will be crucial. Making the wrong assumption in either direction can have catastrophic consequences. Treat someone as hostile when they're actually trying to help, and you lose valuable intelligence and local support. Treat someone as friendly when they're actually planning to harm you, and people die. Rodriguez raised his hand. How do we make those distinctions reliably? Training, experience, and teamwork, Captain Chin replied. You observe carefully, you communicate constantly with your team members, you follow protocols for threat assessment, and you never assume that what you see on the surface tells the whole story. Lisa Chun found herself thinking about how much her perspective on assessment and assumptions had changed over the past few months. Ma'am, what role do our previous experiences play in making these judgments? Captain Chun paused, considering the question carefully. Your background and experience provide context for understanding situations, she said. But they can also create blind spots if you're not careful. The key is using your experience to inform your observations without letting it override what you're actually seeing. She looked directly at Lisa as she continued. For example, if you grew up in a rural area, you might have insights about agricultural communities that could be valuable in understanding local dynamics. But if you assume that all rural communities work the same way everywhere, you might miss important cultural differences that could affect your mission. Williams had been thinking about the parallels between their training experiences and what they might face overseas. Ma'am, how do we apply the teamwork lessons we learned during training to a combat environment? That's an excellent question, Captain Chin said. In training, you learn to set aside assumptions and work effectively with people who are different from you. In combat, those skills become even more critical because the stakes are much higher. She walked closer to the group, her expression serious. Over there, your life might depend on a soldier who doesn't look like you, doesn't come from the same background as you, doesn't share your beliefs or your experiences. If you've learned to see past surface differences and recognize competence regardless of packaging, you'll be able to trust and rely on each other effectively. Jackson raised his hand. What about working with local interpreters and guides? Captain Chun smiled slightly. Another excellent question. You'll be working closely with local nationals who serve as interpreters, guides, and cultural advisors. These people are taking enormous risks to help us, and their knowledge and insights will be invaluable for mission success. She paused, letting the importance of this sink in. But here's the challenge. Many of these local nationals won't look like American soldiers. They won't act like American soldiers. They may have different religious beliefs, different cultural practices, different ways of communicating. If you've learned to recognize competence and value regardless of appearances, you'll be able to work with them effectively. If you haven't learned those lessons, you'll miss opportunities and potentially put everyone at risk. The briefing continued for another hour, covering specific tactical procedures, rules of engagement, and communication protocols. But the underlying message was clear. Everything they had learned about working together, seeing past assumptions, and respecting competence regardless of packaging would be essential for success in their deployment. 2 weeks later, they were in Syria. The forward operating base was a collection of temporary structures and defensive positions carved out of the harsh desert landscape. The heat was oppressive, the living conditions were Spartan, and the constant awareness of potential threats created a level of stress none of them had experienced before. But they adapted quickly. The training they had received, both technical and personal, served them well in adjusting to the realities of deployment life. Their first few weeks were spent on relatively routine patrols and security duties, allowing them to get accustomed to the environment and the operational procedures. But in their fourth week, they received their first significant mission assignment. Intelligence reports had indicated increased insurgent activity in a village about 20 kilometers from their base. The unit was tasked with conducting a presence patrol through the area, gathering information about local conditions, and establishing contact with village leadership. Captain Shun called the platoon together for the mission briefing. "This is exactly the kind of operation that will test everything you've learned," she said. "We're going into an area where we don't have complete information, where the local population may view us with suspicion, and where threats could come from unexpected directions." She pointed to the map showing their planned route. "Our primary objectives are to demonstrate a positive American presence, gather intelligence about insurgent activities, and build relationships with local leaders. But we also need to remain alert for potential threats and be prepared to defend ourselves if necessary." Morrison had been designated as one of the team leaders for the mission. "Ma'am, what do we know about the local leadership structure?" "Good question," Captain Shun replied. "According to our cultural advisor, the village has both traditional tribal leaders and newer political figures who have emerged since the conflict began. Understanding those dynamics and showing appropriate respect to both groups will be crucial for building trust." She gestured to a man in civilian clothes who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room. "I'd like you all to meet Rashid Al-Mansuri. He'll be serving as our interpreter and cultural advisor for this mission." Rashid is a Syrian national who has been working with coalition forces for over 2 years. His knowledge of local customs, language, and political dynamics will be invaluable. Rashid stood up and nodded to the assembled soldiers. He was a slight man in his 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes. His English was excellent, though accented. "I'm honored to work with your unit," he said. "I hope that my knowledge can help you accomplish your mission safely and effectively." Williams raised his hand. "Rashid, what should we know about local attitudes toward American forces?" Rashid considered the question carefully. "The situation is complicated," he said. "Some people see American forces as protectors who can help bring stability and security. Others see them as foreign occupiers who don't understand local culture. Most people are simply trying to survive and will judge you based on how you treat them and their community." Rodriguez asked, "What are the most important cultural considerations we should keep in mind?" "Respect," Rashid answered immediately. "Show respect for local customs, religious practices, and social hierarchies. Don't make assumptions about what people believe or how they live. Ask questions when you're uncertain, and listen carefully to the answers." Lisa Chan found herself thinking about the parallels between Rashid's advice and the lessons they had learned during training. The underlying principles were the same. Don't assume, listen carefully, show respect, recognize that competence and knowledge come in many forms. After the briefing, the team spent time preparing their equipment and reviewing their tactical procedures. But Morrison found himself thinking more about the personal dynamics of the mission than the technical aspects. 6 months earlier, he would have looked at Rashid and seen only a foreign civilian who couldn't possibly understand military operations. Now he saw an expert in cultural intelligence who possessed knowledge that could be crucial for mission success. The difference wasn't just in his attitude toward Rashid specifically, but in his entire approach to assessment and teamwork. He had learned to recognize competence regardless of what package it came in, and that lesson was about to be tested in a real combat environment. The patrol left the base before dawn, traveling in a convoy of armored vehicles toward the target village. The landscape was harsh and barren, with rocky hills and scattered vegetation that provided numerous potential hiding places for hostile forces. As they approached the village, Captain Shun called for a halt to review their approach plan. The settlement was larger than expected, with several hundred residents and a complex layout of traditional and modern buildings. "Remember," she said over the radio, "we're here to build relationships and gather information. Stay alert, but don't treat every civilian as a potential threat. Use your judgment and trust your training." Morrison's team was assigned to patrol the eastern section of the village, while other teams covered different areas. As they dismounted from their vehicles and began moving on foot, Morrison felt the weight of responsibility for his team members' safety. The village was bustling with activity despite the early hour. Children played in the dusty streets. Women carried water from communal wells, and men gathered in small groups to drink tea and discuss the day's activities. The arrival of American soldiers created a noticeable change in the atmosphere. Not panic exactly, but a heightened awareness and caution. Rashid proved invaluable almost immediately. As they approached the first group of villagers, he engaged them in conversation in Arabic, explaining who the soldiers were and what they were doing. His presence and explanations seemed to ease some of the tension. They are concerned about reports of insurgent activity in the area. Rashid translated after speaking with an elderly man who appeared to be a community leader. They say there have been strangers in the village at night, armed men who demand food and information. Rodriguez asked, "Do they know where these insurgents are based?" Rashid translated the question and listened carefully to the response. He says there's an abandoned compound about 5 kilometers north of here where they think the strangers may be staying. But he emphasizes that they are not certain, and they are afraid of retaliation if they provide information. This was exactly the kind of intelligence they had hoped to gather, but Morrison recognized that how they handled the situation would affect not just this mission, but future operations in the area. "Tell them we appreciate the information," Morrison said, "and ask if there's anything we can do to help the village improve their security." The question surprised both Rashid and the village elder. Most military patrols focused on extracting information rather than offering assistance. After another conversation in Arabic, Rashid reported back. He says they would appreciate help repairing the well pump in the center of the village. It has been broken for several weeks, and people have to walk much farther to get water. Williams looked at Morrison questioningly. Repairing well pumps wasn't part of their assigned mission, and they didn't have the technical expertise or equipment for that kind of project. But Lisa Chun had an idea. "Thompson has mechanical training," she said, "and we've got some basic tools with us. Maybe we could at least take a look at it." Morrison made a quick decision. Rashid asked if they would be willing to show us the well pump. "We can't promise we can fix it, but we can take a look." The offer seemed to surprise and please the village elder. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around the well in the center of the village, watching as Thompson examined the pump mechanism. "It's not too complicated," Thompson reported after a few minutes of inspection. "The drive belt is broken, and there's a clogged filter. I think we can jury-rig a temporary fix with what we have, but they'll need to get proper replacement parts for a permanent solution." While Thompson worked on the pump with assistance from 2 local men who had mechanical experience, the rest of the team continued their patrol. But the atmosphere in the village had changed noticeably. Children who had been wary of the soldiers were now watching with curiosity, and several adults approached Rashid with questions about American intentions in the area. The breakthrough came when Thompson successfully got the pump working again. Water flowed from the well for the first time in weeks, and the villagers' gratitude was obvious even without translation. "This is very good," Rashid said to Morrison as they watched the celebration around the well. "Word of this will spread to other villages. You have shown that Americans can be helpful, not just demanding." Jackson, who had been watching the interaction between Thompson and the local mechanics, made an observation. "They knew exactly what was wrong with the pump," he said. "They just didn't have the right replacement parts." The comment highlighted something important that Morrison was beginning to understand. The villagers weren't helpless or ignorant. They had knowledge and skills that were perfectly adapted to their environment. What they lacked were resources and security, not competence. As the patrol continued through the village, this understanding shaped their interactions with local residents. Instead of approaching conversations as interrogations of potential threats, they began asking questions about local conditions, challenges, and needs. The information they gathered was far more useful than anything a traditional military patrol might have obtained. They learned about the patterns of insurgent activity, the economic pressures affecting the community, the political dynamics between different groups in the area, and the specific security concerns that kept villagers awake at night. More importantly, they established relationships that would prove valuable for future operations. Village leaders now had faces to associate with American forces, not anonymous soldiers who appeared occasionally to demand information, but individuals who had taken time to understand local perspectives and provide assistance. When they returned to base that evening, Captain Chin debriefed the mission with obvious satisfaction. "You accomplished every one of our primary objectives," she said to the assembled patrol members. "You gathered significant intelligence about insurgent activities, you established positive contact with village leadership, and you demonstrated a beneficial American presence." She paused, then added, "But more importantly, you demonstrated that you understand the principles that make these kinds of missions successful. You showed respect for local knowledge and capabilities. You recognized that cooperation is more effective than coercion, and you proved that taking time to understand different perspectives leads to better intelligence and stronger relationships. Morrison raised his hand. Ma'am, how important was Rashid's contribution to our success? Captain Chin smiled. Essential. Without his cultural knowledge and language skills, you would have struggled to communicate effectively with the villagers. But the more important question is, how well did you work with him? Rodriguez answered, once we started listening to his advice and following his lead on cultural issues, everything became much easier. He understood things about the situation that we would never have figured out on our own. And how does that relate to the lessons you learned during training? Captain Chin asked. Williams responded thoughtfully, it's the same principle. Don't assume that you know everything you need to know based on your own experience. Recognize that other people have knowledge and capabilities that you can learn from, even if they don't look like what you expect an expert to look like. Lisa Chin added, 6 months ago, we probably would have treated Rashid as just a translator instead of recognizing him as a subject matter expert. We would have missed most of what he could teach us. Captain Chin nodded. That's exactly right. And that kind of thinking will be crucial for every mission we conduct over here. The intelligence you gather today came from building relationships and showing respect, not from aggressive questioning or intimidation. Over the following weeks, their unit conducted numerous similar missions throughout their area of operations. Each one reinforced the lessons they had learned about teamwork, cultural awareness, and the importance of recognizing competence regardless of its packaging. They worked with female interpreters who navigated complex gender dynamics in conservative communities. They partnered with tribal leaders whose traditional knowledge about local terrain and politics proved more accurate than satellite intelligence. They collaborated with former insurgents who had switched sides and whose insights into enemy tactics were invaluable for protecting coalition forces. In each case, their success depended on their ability to set aside preconceptions and work effectively with people who were different from them in fundamental ways. The skills they had developed during training, listening carefully, respecting different perspectives, recognizing expertise wherever it appeared, proved essential for mission success. But the most significant test of their growth came during their 3rd month of deployment, when they received intelligence about a planned attack on their base. The information came from an unexpected source, a young woman named Amira who worked as a cleaning contractor on the base. She had overheard conversations among some of the local national workers that suggested an insider attack was being planned. Initially, several soldiers in the unit were skeptical of the intelligence. Amira was young, female, and worked in a seemingly menial position. In their previous way of thinking, she wouldn't have seemed like a credible source of important security information. But Morrison and his team had learned to look past surface appearances. They took Amira's report seriously, conducted a thorough investigation, and discovered that she was correct. A small group of locally hired workers had been recruited by insurgents to plant explosives in one of the base's dining facilities. The attack was prevented, and several American lives were saved, because soldiers who had once made judgments based on assumptions had learned to recognize valuable intelligence regardless of its source. After the incident, Captain Chin addressed the entire company about what had happened. 3 months ago, she said, some of you might have dismissed Amir's report because she didn't fit your expectations of what an intelligence source should look like. You might have assumed that a young woman who cleaned buildings couldn't possibly have access to important security information. She paused, scanning the faces of her soldiers. But you've learned that competence and knowledge come in many forms. You've learned that assumptions can be dangerous, and that taking people seriously regardless of their appearance or background isn't just the right thing to do. It's tactically smart. Morrison thought about how much his perspective had changed since that night at Murphy's Bar. The soldier he'd been 6 months earlier would indeed have dismissed Amir's concerns. He would have made assumptions about her capabilities based on her gender, her age, and her position, and those assumptions could have cost American lives. But the training had changed more than just his attitude toward other people. It had changed his approach to problem-solving, decision-making, and leadership. He had learned to gather information from multiple sources, to question his own assumptions, and to value input from anyone who might have relevant knowledge or insights. Those skills, he was beginning to understand, were what made the difference between good soldiers and great soldiers. They were what separated military units that merely completed their assigned tasks from units that excelled in complex, challenging environments. As their deployment continued, Morrison and his teammates continued to grow and develop as soldiers and as people. They faced moral dilemmas, tactical challenges, and personal struggles that tested their character and their competence. But through it all, they maintained the fundamental principles they had learned during their training: respect for others regardless of differences, recognition of competence wherever it appeared, and the understanding that effective teamwork required seeing people clearly rather than through the lens of prejudice and assumption. By the time their deployment ended and they prepared to return home, they had become exactly the kind of soldiers Captain Chun had hoped to develop: technically proficient, tactically smart, and wise enough to recognize that their greatest strength came not from their individual capabilities, but from their ability to work together effectively with anyone who shared their commitment to mission success. The transformation that had begun with humiliation in a bar and continued through months of demanding training had been completed in the crucible of actual combat operations. They had learned not just how to be soldiers, but how to be the kind of people who could succeed in any environment that required cooperation, understanding, and the wisdom to see past surface appearances to underlying truth. 18 months after that fateful night at Murphy's Bar, the 6 soldiers found themselves back at Fort Bragg, preparing to transition from their first deployment to new assignments within the military. They had returned as decorated veterans, having earned commendations for their service in Syria and recognition for their exceptional teamwork and cultural sensitivity. But perhaps more importantly, they had returned as fundamentally different people than they had been when they left. The change was evident in everything they did. When new recruits arrived at the base, Morrison and his friends naturally fell into mentoring roles, sharing not just tactical knowledge, but the deeper lessons they had learned about respect, assumptions, and the true meaning of military service. During one such session, Morrison found himself addressing a group of young soldiers who reminded him painfully of his former self: cocky, certain of their own superiority, and quick to make judgments based on appearances. The most important thing you need to understand, Morrison told them, is that being a good soldier isn't about proving how tough you are or showing that you're better than anyone else. It's about learning to work effectively with people who are different from you and recognizing that competence comes in many different forms. One of the new recruits, a young man named Davis who bore a striking resemblance to Morrison at that age, raised his hand skeptically. But isn't military training about weeding out people who aren't strong enough to handle combat? Morrison exchanged glances with Rodriguez, who was helping with the training session. They both remembered asking similar questions during their own early training. Military training is about identifying people who have the character and capability to be effective soldiers, Morrison replied. But if you think that means everyone has to look the same, think the same, or come from the same background, you're going to miss a lot of talent. He walked over to a display case that held photographs and commendations from recent deployments. Among them was a picture of their unit with Amira, the young woman whose intelligence had prevented the attack on their base. "See this woman?" Morrison asked, pointing to Amira's photograph. "She saved American lives by providing intelligence about a planned terrorist attack. If we had dismissed her concerns because she was young, female, and worked in a cleaning position, soldiers would have died." Davis looked at the photograph with obvious surprise. "She was an intelligence asset. She was a person with information that was crucial for our safety," Rodriguez corrected. "The lesson is that you can't judge people's capabilities or knowledge based on what they look like or what job they have." Lisa Chun, who had joined the session to share her own experiences, added, "When we first deployed, we worked with interpreters, cultural advisors, local leaders, and community members who didn't look anything like American soldiers. But their knowledge and insights were essential for mission success." She paused, then said something that would have been impossible for her to understand 18 months earlier. "If we had stuck with our original assumptions about who could contribute valuable information, we would have failed at most of our missions." After the training session, the 6 friends gathered at the same restaurant where they had celebrated completing basic training nearly 2 years earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Gone was the boisterous arrogance that had characterized their earlier celebration. Instead, their conversation was thoughtful, reflective, and focused on the experiences that had shaped them during their deployment. "I keep thinking about Captain Chen's first lecture," Williams said, "when she told us about the medic who saved 12 lives despite being smaller than most of the wounded soldiers she had to carry. At the time, I thought she was just making a point about not judging people by their size." He took a sip of his beer and continued. "But Now I realize she was teaching us something much more fundamental about how to see situations clearly, about how assumptions can blind us to reality. Marcus nodded. I had a similar realization when we were working with that tribal leader in the village near Aleppo. Remember Hassan? The guy who looked like he couldn't be more than 20 years old. They all remembered Hassan, a slight, soft-spoken young man who had initially seemed too young and inexperienced to be a community leader. When we first met him, I was thinking, this kid can't possibly understand the political dynamics we're dealing with, Marcus continued. But it turned out he had better intelligence about insurgent movements than our official sources did. He had been tracking their patterns for months, and his insights were crucial for planning our security operations. Jackson added, and his age was actually an advantage, not a disadvantage. He could move through the community and ask questions in ways that older leaders couldn't. People trusted him because they saw him as part of their generation, someone who understood their concerns. Rodriguez had been thinking about a different aspect of their transformation. You know what I find interesting? How much more effective we became as a team once we learned to really listen to each other. He gestured around the table. Take this group. We're all from different backgrounds, different parts of the country, different families, and experiences. 18 months ago, we bonded over our similarities and ignored our differences. But during deployment, we learned to use our differences as strengths. Lisichin understood exactly what he meant, like that navigation exercise in the mountains outside Damascus. Remember how we got turned around trying to follow the map? They all remembered the incident clearly. Their unit had been tasked with reaching a village that wasn't clearly marked on their standard military maps, and they had spent hours going in circles trying to locate it. Williams grew up hiking in Colorado mountains, so he understood terrain in ways the rest of us didn't, Lisa continued. Kim had experience reading topographical surveys from his engineering background. Thompson understood mechanical indicators that could tell us about water sources and human activity. Morrison picked up the thread, and instead of arguing about who was right or trying to prove that we knew the answer, we actually listened to each other and combined our knowledge. We found the village faster than any other unit had before. The conversation continued as they reflected on the specific incidents and relationships that had taught them the most important lessons of their military service. Jackson talked about learning to work with Fatima, a female interpreter who navigated complex cultural dynamics in conservative communities where gender roles were strictly defined. I had to learn that effective leadership sometimes meant stepping back and letting someone else take the lead because she understood aspects of the social situation that I never could. Williams described working with Dr. Mahmoud, an elderly Syrian physician who had volunteered to help treat both American soldiers and local civilians. He taught me that competence isn't just about technical skills. It's about wisdom, experience, and the ability to make good decisions under pressure. Things you can't learn from a manual or a training exercise. As the evening progressed, their conversation inevitably turned to Captain Chun and the role she had played in their transformation. I owe her an apology, Morrison said suddenly. Not for that night at Murphy's bar. We already apologized for that, and she accepted it. But for taking so long to understand what she was really trying to teach us. Rodriguez looked puzzled. What do you mean? Morrison struggled to find the right words. During training, I thought she was teaching us to be more polite to people who were different from us. Like it was about good manners or political correctness or something. He paused, organizing his thoughts. But that wasn't it all. She was teaching us to be better soldiers, better leaders, better at gathering intelligence, building relationships, solving problems, working as a team. All the stuff that actually matters in real military operations. Lisa Chen nodded slowly. You're right. She wasn't trying to change our attitudes for moral reasons, though that was important too. She was trying to change our thinking for tactical reasons. Williams added, because soldiers who can only work effectively with people who look like them, think like them, and come from similar backgrounds are limited soldiers. They can only succeed in very narrow circumstances. The realization was profound and somewhat humbling. They had spent months thinking that Captain Chun was teaching them to be better people when she was actually teaching them to be more effective professionals. Jackson raised his glass. To Captain Chun, he said, for seeing potential in us that we didn't see in ourselves. They all raised their glasses and drank to their former instructor, but Morrison wasn't finished with his thoughts. You know what's really crazy, he said. That night at Murphy's bar, we thought we were teaching her about what real soldiers were like. We were so convinced that we understood military service better than she did. The irony was painful, but important to acknowledge. Rodriguez laughed, but not with humor. We were like children trying to explain physics to Einstein, completely clueless about our own ignorance. Marcus had been thinking about the broader implications of their experience. But here's what worries me, he said. How many other soldiers are out there making the same mistakes we made? How many military units are less effective than they could be because they can't see past their own assumptions? It was a sobering question that they had all considered at various times during their deployment. That's why what we're doing with the new recruits is so important, Lisa said. We can't change everyone, but we could try to share what we learned with the soldiers who come after us. Williams nodded. And we can try to be the kind of leaders who create environments where people are evaluated on their actual capabilities rather than on what they look like or where they come from. As the evening drew to a close, Morrison found himself thinking about the full arc of their journey from that humiliating night at Murphy's Bar to their current roles as experienced combat veterans and mentors to new soldiers. The transformation had been more complete and more fundamental than any of them could have imagined. They had changed not just their attitudes toward others, but their entire approach to leadership, problem-solving, and military service. They had learned that true strength came from the ability to work effectively with anyone who shared their commitment to mission success, regardless of differences in background, appearance, or approach. They had discovered that intelligence and competence came in forms they had never expected, and that their own effectiveness as soldiers depended on their ability to recognize and leverage those qualities in others. Most importantly, they had learned that the military values they thought they understood, honor, courage, duty, were far more complex and demanding than they had realized. Honor meant treating others with dignity regardless of differences. Courage meant being willing to examine and change deeply held prejudices. Duty meant taking responsibility not just for personal performance, but for creating conditions where every member of the team could contribute effectively. A few months later, Morrison received word that he had been selected for promotion and would be attending officer training school. The recommendation had come from Captain Chun, who had written in her evaluation that he had demonstrated exceptional growth in leadership capability and tactical thinking. When he went to thank her, Morrison found Captain Chun in her office, preparing for her own next assignment. She had been selected to command a training battalion responsible for developing new infantry officers. "Ma'am," Morrison said, "I wanted to thank you for the recommendation, and for everything else." Captain Chun looked up from her paperwork and smiled. "You earned that recommendation, Morrison. You and your team became excellent soldiers." Morrison hesitated, then decided to ask the question that had been bothering him for months. "Ma'am, that night at Murphy's Bar, did you know we were going to be in your training unit?" Captain Chun considered the question carefully. "I knew that new recruits would be arriving on Monday morning," she said. "I didn't know specifically that you six would be among them." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "But I wasn't entirely surprised when I saw familiar faces in the formation." Morrison felt his face burn with embarrassment again. "Were you angry? Did you want to punish us?" "Angry? No," Captain Chun replied. "Disappointed? Yes. You six had just completed basic training, which means you had received months of instruction about military values and professional behavior. But you clearly hadn't internalized those lessons." She leaned back in her chair. "As for punishment, Morrison, do you think the training you received was punishment?" The question made Morrison think carefully about his answer. "No, ma'am. It was challenging, but it was exactly what we needed to become good soldiers." "That's right," Captain Chun said. "Punishment is about making someone suffer for past mistakes. Training is about building capability for future success. I was never interested in making you suffer. I was interested in making you competent." Morrison nodded, understanding the distinction. "Ma'am, can I ask you something else?" Captain Chun gestured for him to continue. "How did you know we could change? How did you know we weren't just permanently prejudiced?" Captain Chun thought about the question for a moment. "Everyone has prejudices, Morrison. The difference is whether people are willing to examine them and change them when presented with evidence that they're wrong." She stood up and walked to her window, which looked out over the training areas where new soldiers were learning the same lessons Morrison and his friends had mastered. That night at the bar, you six were operating on assumptions you had never really questioned. But when you were put in situations that challenged those assumptions, when you had to work with people who didn't fit your preconceptions, You were willing to adapt and learn. She turned back to face him. That willingness to learn is what made the difference. It's what allowed you to become the soldiers you are today. Morrison felt a surge of gratitude toward the woman who had seen potential in them when they couldn't see it themselves. "Thank you, ma'am, for not giving up on us." Captain Shin smiled. "Morrison, part of being a leader is understanding that people can grow and change if they're given the right opportunities and guidance. My job was to provide those opportunities. Your job was to take advantage of them." She walked back to her desk and picked up a folder. "And speaking of opportunities, you'll be working with a very diverse group of officer candidates when you get to training school. Some of them will be older than you, some younger. Some will be male, some female. Some will come from military families. Others will be the first in their families to serve. Some will have college degrees. Others will have worked their way up through the enlisted ranks." Morrison understood immediately what she was telling him. Your success as an officer will depend on your ability to recognize the strengths and capabilities that each of these people brings, regardless of what they look like or where they come from, Captain Shin continued. "The lessons you learned during your training about seeing people clearly, working effectively across differences, building teams based on competence rather than comfort, will be essential for your development as a leader." As Morrison left Captain Shin's office, he reflected on how far he and his friends had traveled from that night at Murphy's Bar. They had begun as soldiers who thought they understood military service, but actually knew very little about its true demands and rewards. They had been transformed through training that challenged not just their physical capabilities, but their fundamental assumptions about people, teamwork, and leadership. They had been tested in combat situations that required them to apply those lessons under the most demanding circumstances possible. And they had emerged as leaders who understood that military effectiveness depended not on conformity or assumption, but on the ability to recognize and leverage human potential wherever it appeared. The journey had been humbling, challenging, and at times painful, but it had also been transformative in ways that would shape not just their military careers, but their entire approach to life, relationships, and service to others. As Morrison walked across the base toward his next training session, he passed a group of new recruits who looked remarkably similar to the young soldiers he and his friends had been 18 months earlier. They were talking loudly about their expectations for military service, making assumptions about who belonged in the Army and who didn't, confident in their own superiority and dismissive of anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of what a soldier should be. Morrison smiled, remembering his own certainty at that age. He made a mental note to volunteer for their training program. These young soldiers, like he and his friends, had the potential to become excellent leaders if they could learn to see past their assumptions and recognize the true meaning of military service. The transformation was possible. He was living proof of that. And with the right guidance and opportunities, the next generation of soldiers could learn the same lessons that had made him and his teammates not just better soldiers, but better people. The circle would continue, each group of transformed soldiers helping to shape the next, building a military culture that valued competence over conformity, understanding over assumption, and teamwork over individual prejudice. It was, Morrison realized, exactly what Captain Shun had been trying to accomplish all along.